Hello everyone. Most of you probably remember that in the first video I ever posted to this channel, I reviewed both Percy Jackson movies. In that video, I mentioned the fact that the series was going to be given a reboot in the form of a show on Disney+. I then stated that I was planning to review the series in its entirety once all of the first season's episodes were released. Today, that day has come, and being a man of my word, that means it's time to share my thoughts on the show Percy Jackson and the Olympians. Before we get started, I think I should mention a few things. Firstly, if you're unfamiliar with the Percy Jackson book series and my relationship with it, I recommend you go watch my previous video, where I briefly go over the story told in the first book and talk about how I started reading the book series as a kid, link in the description. Secondly, I think it's important to note that I'm going to be splitting this review into 3 categories, those being technical, where I go over the effects, tone, etc., the cast, and the story, both of which I think are self-explanatory. With that out of the way, we can begin. From a technical perspective, the show is, unsurprisingly, pretty good. For starters, the effects were absolutely stellar in every episode, and did a great job of bringing life to a lot of the ancient fantasy locations described in the books, while blending them with the real-life modern world in a way that felt natural and easy to understand. The monsters and other creatures also looked amazing, and once again, the creators did an exceptional job at bringing life to these creatures who were once only described in legend right in front of our eyes. Admittedly, I think they could have done a little bit of a better job at making the Minotaur look more intimidating, but that's just a minor nitpick. I also think that the soundtrack could have been better. Don't get me wrong, it's not bad by any means, but none of the songs especially stand out, in my opinion. On a similar note, I think it would have been cool if the series took place in the 2000s, which is when the original books came out. If they had done that, they could have included a bunch of nostalgic songs from back then. With enough love and care, I really think that what Stranger Things was for the 80s, this show could have been for the 2000s. Again, it's not a big deal by any means, but it was a fun idea and a bit of a missed opportunity in my opinion. But regardless, apart from what are admittedly very minor nitpicks, the show is great on a technical level. Next, let's talk about the cast. When I was rereading the books over the summer, before I even knew that a new show was in the works, I couldn't help but do some mental casting for a lot of the characters mentioned in the story. In my mind, I pictured younger versions of Logan Lerman, Alexandra Daddario, and Brandon T. Jackson as Percy, Annabeth, and Grover respectively, a younger Dacre Montgomery as Luke Castellan, a young and very angry Sadie Sink as Clarice LaRue, Clancy Brown as Chiron, Ewan McGregor as Zeus, Pedro Pascal as Poseidon, Samuel Jackson as Hades, Stone Cold Steve Austin as Ares, and John Hamm as Hermes. Now, I'm not delusional. I'm aware that this cast could never exist for a variety of reasons. The main one being that none of the ages line up at all, and as of now, I'm pretty sure time travel doesn't exist. The reason I'm telling you all this is so that you're all aware of how I, personally, interpreted each of these characters before watching the show. This way, before commenting on the actors' abilities to bring them to life, you all know where I'm coming from. First things first, Walker Scobell, Leah Jeffries, and Ryan Simhadri all did absolutely fantastic jobs as Percy, Annabeth, and Grover. The 3 of them had a beautiful dynamic throughout the entire season. All 3 of them did amazing jobs at bringing their characters to life, and all 3 of them deserve all the recognition in the world for their work in the series. Huge props to each of them, they all did a fantastic job. For Ares, as a pro wrestling fan myself, the idea to cast a wrestler to play him was a no-brainer, and clearly, the makers of the show shared my sentiment. While a few others came to my mind in addition to the aforementioned Steve Austin, I have to be honest and respectfully say that Adam Copeland really wasn't one of them. However, despite not being my first choice, I'll be the first to say that he ended up doing a pretty solid job. He was intimidating when he had to be and was ultimately pretty convincing at being Ares. Jason Mantzoukas did a fantastic job as Dionysus. His mannerisms, speaking style, etc. were pretty much exactly how I imagined them to be while reading the book. Glenn Turman did a great job as Chiron, and I think it's a huge shame that we didn't get to see more of him considering how good of a job he really did. Lance Reddick and Toby Stephens both did fantastic jobs as Zeus and Poseidon respectively. Lance did an amazing job at coming across as regal, authoritative, and intimidating all simultaneously, and it was very easy to believe Poseidon's kindness and gentleness from Toby Stephens. If I'm being honest, I only had 2 serious criticisms with the cast. The first being that I really think Hades was played too casually, and should have been much more intimidating. The second, and the more important one in my opinion, is that Gabe wasn't mean enough. For those of you who are watching and are unfamiliar with the books, Gabe is a horrible human being for a variety of reasons. The Lightning Thief movie did a pretty good job of demonstrating that, while the series made him come off as way too comedic. Sure, he was still slightly annoying, but that's not nearly enough. When I look at Gabe, I am supposed to hate this man. I should want to jump through the TV so that I can zap him with laser eyes. This version of the character does not make me feel that way, and in my opinion, that is a flaw. Lastly, let's talk about the most important aspect of the show, the story. Again, keep in mind that this is coming from someone who was a fan of the books. The Percy Jackson series, along with Goosebumps, was my favorite book series as a kid, and I really enjoyed my recent reread of the series. So, how does this show do at bringing the story told in the books to the screen? Well, right off the bat, I'll say that this is a much better adaptation of the story than the movies were. For one, the movies didn't have Ares or Cerberus. Right away, that is a big plus in the direction of the show. With that being said, though, it's still not perfect. Like I said earlier, I'm really not a fan of Gabe's characterization at all. I also think that the series rushed a lot of the backstory about Percy's childhood, his friendship with Grover, and the build-up to him going to Camp Half-Blood. I also found the segment in episode 5 where Percy has to be trapped in Hephaestus' golden throne to be a very unnecessary addition, and I strongly dislike episode 6's telling of the Lotus Casino events. With that being said, though, accurate doesn't always equal good, and there were some changes the show made that I honestly think was better than the book's version. For instance, the show's version of Medusa was extremely interesting compared to the very one-dimensional version of the character seen in the first book. There were a few other minor changes from the book as well, but if I'm being honest, who cares? Things like that aren't essential to the story, and complaining about them borders on nitpicking at this point. Now, a lot of you are probably sitting at home asking yourselves, so, is this show worth my time? And my answer to that is a loud, thundering, resounding yes. If you like fantasy, if you like action, if you like intimidating monsters and courageous heroes, this is a show for you. The show is renewed for a second season, which I am very excited about, and while we wait, I highly recommend you try reading the books. Even if the idea of reading a whole book from cover to cover by yourself sounds a little daunting, you can find most of them on Audible, or you can find several fan readings for all of them right here on YouTube. In conclusion, the Disney Plus Percy Jackson series is not a perfect adaptation of the story told in the books. It certainly has its flaws, and some of them can, occasionally, be a little bit frustrating. However, said frustrations are few and far between, and despite the show's imperfections, it is an infinitely better adaptation of the story than the movies were, and I look forward to seeing what the show has in store next season.